On. In this first of our panel discussions, where we'll be digging a little deeper into the topic, we wanted to pose one of the questions that kind of we at MCC Brussels, being, as Katalin said when she introduced us, a Hungarian think tank, one of the questions that's often kind of posed to us, which is what do the countries of Central or Eastern Europe have to offer in European politics and in the culture wars kind of more generally? And one of the things that we thought it would be very interesting to explore in this opening session is how the war against the past and these battles over cultural memory play out in slightly different fashions as you move from Western Europe towards Eastern Europe. And I know that there'll be plenty of people from Central and Eastern Europe in the audience, but for me, I'm British, and one of the things I noticed the more I began to travel across Central and Eastern Europe was the past and the status of the past and the concept of historical memory plays a very different role in contemporary societies in Central and Eastern Europe than maybe it does in the West, not just because of the kind of fresher memory of communism in many places, which had its own kind of history wars embedded within it, but also because for some reason some of the importance of history perhaps still seems to carry kind of greater weight in some Central and Eastern European countries. So we thought it'd be really interesting to dig into this question in a bit of detail, and we've got a really interesting panel to help us kind of guide through this. So first, I'm delighted to say that we'll be hearing a little bit more from Katalin, who, as she introduced herself, as one of our senior researchers at MCC Brussels. And as you might have guessed from opening the conference, Katalin has been the brains and also the kind of legwork behind the conference today. So we're really, really glad that Katalin will say a few words. And this marks a small change from our scheduled programming, as Chantal Dessol, who was supposed to be with us, unfortunately picked up a little illness over the last couple of days and couldn't make the trip. So we're sad to lose Chantal, but I'm delighted that we give Katalin another shot at explaining some of these things. Then we'll hear from Lawrence Goldman, who's sitting here next to me. He's a lecturer in modern history at the University of Oxford, a contributor to The Telegraph, and one of the kind of thinkers and activists involved in a really interesting project called History Reclaimed. I suggest you go and check out their website. They're doing a lot, especially in the UK, but a bit more broadly, to challenge some of the trends that Frank outlined in his opening speech. So delighted that Lawrence will be joining us. And then finally, we'll hear from Aaron Mate, who's a historian, but also, and very relevantly for our topic today, he's the vice chairman of the National Remembrance Committee, and I'm sure he'll bring some of those insights to bear with us. So, but without any further ado, I'd like to ask Katalin to take to the podium, and I'll be delighted to hear what you got to say. Can we welcome Katalin again?
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you for introducing me. As you see, Chantal Dessol should stand here, and of course I'm not going to replace her or supply her. I'm going to speak for myself, and I'm going to speak in the position of the main organizer of this event. And what I'm going to do is to share my thoughts with you, why this conference was important for me, why I was so happy when Frank asked me to help him to organize this conference, and also why particularly this first panel is really, really important for me. Let me start by that I was born in Czechoslovakia. I belong to the Hungarian minority. I grew up surrounded by 3 cultures, 3 languages. I always lived on the border of different cultures. And you know, belonging to an ethnic or linguistical minority, it is so important for us to ask ourselves always about our historical belonging, the cultural belonging, the big questions: where do we come from? Where do we belong? What is the meaning of history? What is the meaning of national history? And where I find myself within this complex entity. I was born also under the communism. So the phenomenon of the war against the past is not unknown for me. Communism started a war against the past too. It attacked the past, It tried to erase certain periods of the past, to rewrite the past, and largely to manipulate the past. As a young girl, I was working in the State Jewish Museum in Prague. This was one of my very, very important learning in life about history and past. I remember the dusty exhibitions of Judaica, where the inscriptions, so the history of the exhibited objects, were very scarce. I give you an example. Well, here you see a jog of the Holy Burial Society, in Hebrew, the Chevra Kadisha. It was made in 1752 in Moravia. And no more explanation. There was no one word about what these objects was used to, about the community, and particularly not about that the communities to whom these objects belonged were murdered in the Holocaust. 70,000 Moravian and Bohemian Jews were murdered. So we couldn't read these histories, but the silence and the emptiness around these objects motivated me and motivated many of us from society to try to open doors, to try to ask questions. So it was actually the silence of history, the absence of history, was a motivating factor. I remember also that reading about history was also a complicated project. We all very often read samizdat literature. For the younger ones here in this cell, I should explain that samizdat is an underground literature. It was typed by a typer and copied and manually and passed from one hand to another hand. And you know, reading about history, asking questions was a holy thing. And it was also a source of creating friendships, loyalties, togetherness. So the most important thing we need to understand with respect to the time before 89 and about the phenomenon of the past, the conception of the past as this time, that we all knew that we live in a lie. And if you live in a lie, you build up a defense strategy. You take a relation to this lie, and sooner or later you are going to start to search after the truth. So in a way, it was easier to face the lie during the communism and the absence of history, but it was more explicit. Then the events of 1989 started. It was like an avalanche of events. It happened so fastly that we didn't even realize what's happening with us. And in 1993, Czechoslovakia fell apart to two countries, two national countries, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic was created. And I suddenly, as a Hungarian from Czechoslovakia, from Central Europe, I found myself in a new memory regime, in a new national memory regime, which was the Slovak history. So I needed to relate myself to this history. But I must say, ladies and gentlemen, that the 90s, that was the most meaningful time in my life. The most meaningful time to question history and to question the past. We needed to open so many shelves, so many windows, you know, like these secret doors, I just mentioned it in the beginning, one door after the other, and small secret spaces we never discovered. So it was a wonderful time. Of course, we needed to ask questions about World War II, the Holocaust, the crimes of the communism. It was a wonderful time, and there my acquaintance, Miroslav Vanyek, appeared in my life from Prague from this time. So it was a kind of apogee of freedom as we defined it at this time. In the 90s, the past was for me a free landscape, suddenly, a landscape that you could revisit without controlled gates, without an ideological, a political vision. It was something amazing for us. Then 2000 came, we passed 2000, then our integration into the European structures became, and in 2004, 8 Central Eastern European countries became member of the European Union, and we all thought, that is wonderful. Now we truly belong to Europe, not just geographically, not just culturally, but also epistemically. And we can unite our history, our past with European history. And then while we could see what's going on the streets, memorials were erased, topped, the memorial of the liberating Soviet soldier disappeared, new memorials came on their place, Holocaust memorials, for the victim of the communism, new museums were opened, and that was very hopeful. And then a few years passed, and we suddenly realized that we find ourselves in a new memory regime of truth. And that this new memory regime of truth is even more complicated and complex and challenging than the old memory regime of the lie. Because you were confused where the truth and when the lie is. And I see my colleague Jacob signalizing me that I maybe reached my time, but this is also fine, because I just stopped raising a question about the regime of truth, of memory, and I think my colleagues can just take this point and speak about their topic, and then we can come back to the discussion about museums and the present. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thanks a lot, Kotzelen. Thanks so much. Lawrence, please, really excited to see what you will introduce us with.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to be invited to speak here today, and also a great pleasure, as I was fortunate to have been asked to read and comment on Frank Furedi's excellent book when it was in typescript. In any case, I've long been a great admirer of Frank's work, especially his journalistic pieces in old-style British academic periodicals, which I read as a young history lecturer in Oxford many years ago. In my view, the war against the past is the most important statement of the intellectual challenge we face in the West, to be published in recent years. I'm also delighted to be here to represent, as has been said, a British organization called History Reclaimed. If you don't know us, Google our name and take a look at our website. We're a group of over 40 British-based historians with many more supporters beyond, trying to prevent the distortion of history by the many ideologies which Frank laid out in his opening remarks just now. My placement in this session with historians from the East as well as West is also very pleasing for two reasons, and the first is purely personal. My daughter is a British diplomat who, in the early stages of the Ukraine war, was sent by the Foreign Office to Kyiv to oversee the UK's program of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. She spent a year there, very few people in the British embassy in that period, dodging Putin's missiles and forging a link with many civil society groups working on the Ukrainian home front. She was also able to visit the site of the Babi Yar massacre of 1941, and we talked later about the way the Ukrainians were coming to grips with their past. The original monument to the tens of thousands who died there, erected in the Soviet era, depicted them as Soviet citizens and soldiers killed by the Nazis. Perhaps because the Soviets knew they were lying, their monument was not even sighted by the ravine where the killing took place. But my daughter visited the new Ukrainian monuments. And even though there are serious disputes over how Ukraine should commemorate the events at Babi Yar and remember those who died there and also those who were responsible for their deaths, there is recognition now that the majority of the victims were Jews and that some of their murderers were Ukrainians acting under Nazi orders. My daughter was struck by the power and the solemnity of the new monuments, and by the many genuine attempts by Ukrainians to understand and accept these aspects of their past. Now, this leads to the second reason for my great satisfaction at being brought together here with historians from across Europe. In my experience in Oxford and in Britain, the current distortions of Western history and their misuse for political ends take their origins, in fact, from events in Eastern Europe between 1989 and 1991. The fall of the wall, the freedom of the states of the east of our continent from domination by the Soviet Union, and then, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union itself. Now, if I may speak personally, these events had a profound effect on me intellectually and politically, and they began a change in my outlook as a citizen and as a historian that was complete by the mid-1990s. The sight of tens of millions of people seeking national independence and democratic self-government was inspiring, and it taught me that state socialism in any form was doomed. Marxism also, as a system of thought and as a way of understanding the past, seemed to have failed. So many people refused to play the role assigned to them in Marxist theory. They wanted personal and political freedom and the chance to improve themselves intellectually as well as materially. However one viewed history, it simply couldn't be maintained that it was the record of class struggle. Consciousness was much more diverse and complicated than the crude class consciousness assigned to people by Marxist theorists and historians. However, most of my colleagues in Oxford and in other British universities seem to ignore the implications of those events in Eastern Europe. Some simply didn't acknowledge that anything had changed. They remained committed to a British version of socialism and to a socialist tradition of scholarship. But there were other British and American academics in the 1990s who clearly began a search for different ways of criticizing and undermining Western liberalism. I recall when this first became clear to me in a seminar in Oxford where a very notable American historian warned us that the fields of culture and race and identity would fill the gap recently vacated by Marxism. And so it has proved. Just as Western social history was subjected to crude forms of Marxist analysis in the 1960s and 1970s, so today Western imperial and foreign history is being subjected to crude forms of anti-imperialism that simplify the history of the West since the 15th century and quite deliberately turn history into a branch of morality so that it can be used in contemporary cultural and political struggles. The academic study of empire, which rightly has always tried to balance between the exploitation involved in colonialism with the beneficial modernization that it also brought with it, has been deliberately marginalized to be replaced by history written as a kind of morality play in which race and color determine whether historical actors are defined as good or bad. In Marxist theory, the bourgeoisie were the villains. In post-colonial theory, their place has been taken by white Europeans. And in both, of course, history has been turned into a weapon in wider political and social struggles. The distortion is deliberate and part of a wider strategy to undermine, in my case, in our case, British national coherence and social solidarity. And it's most evident in perhaps the most famous case, that of Winston Churchill. Churchill was always a target for his anti-socialism. He was an avowed opponent of Bolshevism, a supporter of British intervention in the Russian Revolution. Of course, it was Churchill who coined the term the Iron Curtain in 1946, after the war. He'd been a controversial Home Secretary before the First World War, using British troops to try to police strikes of South Wales coal miners in 1912. And so the British left were often critical of Churchill, but indeed rather more respectful as well of his achievements. But that is not the case among the anti-imperial historians and commentators today who fixed on the many roles he played in the administration and defense of the British Empire and used these to undermine his reputation, even accusing him, while he was directing the Allied war effort in London in 1943, of somehow being responsible for a famine in the Bay of Bengal. For a period at the start of this decade, his statue opposite the Houses of Parliament in Westminster was daubed with paint and graffiti and had to be boarded up for his protection. Now, the arguments over Churchill are not accidental or innocent. He's been the focus of a campaign of disinformation and slander because of his iconic significance in modern British history. If Churchill can be defamed and shamed, then so can the rest of British history. It's my view, then, that the war against the past now is actually much like the former war that Katalin was talking about in her remarks as well. Its heroes are no longer the workers, but all indigenous peoples. Its villains are now imperialists rather than capitalists. State socialism coerced people into accepting the rule of the party and filled their heads with party propaganda. Anti-colonialism in British and Western universities and our mass media also now censors alternative views and cancels people who think differently. Old-style socialism told people that their identity was determined by their class. Anti-colonialism defines people only according to their race. In both cases, the individual is forced to think like everyone else in the group. In both cases, there is a determination to undermine alternative forms of personal identity and indeed alternative forms of politics. The fall of the wall in 1989 marked the end of one war against the past, and sadly it's been replaced by another war. The targets are different, but the aim is the same. So how should historians and thinkers across Europe respond now? I will be brief. Not, I would argue, by seeking to counter one ideology with another, nor by resorting to our own forms of propaganda. It's our duty as scholars to stick to the truth, based on the evidence, reported fairly and used justly. It was the truth about Soviet-style communism, its corruptions, its failings, its lies, which led to its collapse. And it's the truth that will allow us to reclaim history from those who are using it against freedom and against genuine democracy. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Lawrence. Aaron, I'm delighted to welcome you to the podium.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's very embarrassing speaking after Frank Furedi, because I think he has told everything. So now we are just chewing on the details now. But when I read the introduction of this event, which says, I quote, "Whether it is toppling statues, decolonizing the curriculum, or erasing terms from our vocabulary, a cultural crusade is underway designed to render the past toxic. The past is condemned as enemy territory and has become a target of venomous hate," quote ends. This is exactly the same what we in Central Europe and particularly Hungarians have seen before. Any human community, let it be a small group of friends or an entire nation, is not together by three elementary bonds. First, common interest. Secondly, common values. And thirdly, common experiences. And I believe that the third is the most powerful bond. Just imagine meeting your former classmates from the secondary school decades after you graduated. There are always stories which can reform your community again. So I think the past experiences, even if they are abstract because nobody had lived up when they happened, may lay the foundation of a common knowledge, a common pool of expressions, proverbs, etc., altogether a common history. In modernity, the role of folklore diminished. Thus, past is a thing that has to be created time by time by institutions. Without memory institutions, including academia, universities, and the new types of organizations in Central and Eastern Europe, memory will fall into hands of charlatans, self-proclaimed prophets, and dangerous agitators. That's why institutionalized history is key. There is enough literature to fill libraries on the importance of community memory, so I will just quote Cvetan Todorov, a great Bulgarian thinker who lived in exile during communist times. In his book titled The Uses and Abuses of Memory, he wrote, "The tyrannies of the 20th century realized that the seizure of people and territories could only be accomplished through the seizure of information and communication, and systematically and in its entirety they imposed their domination on memory, hoping to reach into the furthest recesses of memory," quote ends. In 1945, the Soviet occupation was labeled by an anti-Soviet politician as, I quote, "the great rift in Hungarian history. The long process of what we proudly call millennium of the Hungarian state has come to an end, and a new era has begun, which is not yet sufficiently marked. So far, the new era is the opposite of everything that the millennium represents and symbolizes," quote ends. But some years later, it was written in a US intelligence paper that communism is the very antithesis of Hungarian nationalism. So there was a problem, or I would say a challenge for communists. And I have to add that there had always been. When during the interwar years, a member of the illegal Communist Party proposed a kind of national youth organization serving as an umbrella in the communist hands, his comrades started to mock him, saying, "He is trying to put on the red, white, green pants," so the Hungarian national colors. Now the communists had to grab the problem somehow. They tried to create a new historical identity. In 1944, in the Hungarian territories already occupied by the Soviet armies, a left-wing social democrat politicians wrote the following: "The millennium-old trial has ended. We stand as witnesses and warriors of the great change that shall defeat feudalism, so that its crimes may thereafter be recorded by history. Libraries shall overflow with the misery of people that has been suffering for 1,000 years. It was feudalism that prevented change and the rise of the Hungarian people. Today sees the collapse of the last bastion of feudalism in Europe, because Hungary has always been famous for managing to uphold feudalism to the very last. 1,000 years of our dark, reactionary, and feudalist past," quote ends. We have to remark that this politician later became a communist, and we also have to add that the very similar messages were pushed for in other countries occupied by the Soviet army. But there was a problem with the masses, as a Marxist would say, I mean with the society. The leader of the communist forces in Hungary, Mátyás Rákosi, lamented in 1948, I quote, "Workers and peasants with traditions of the petite bourgeoisie are now in the Communist Party. Their numbers are growing. Even the best intentioned ones bring with them their old habits and prejudices. Their re-education is very slow. In some areas, for example, in the fight against the reaction in the form of the church, our party is only now getting down to work. Chauvinism also has deep roots. In connection with nationalizations, even in one factory in Budapest, workers petitioned to keep the factory owner, as they described him, their breadwinner master." Quote end. So they started to work. New concepts of Hungarian history were elaborated and new phrases were forged. The glorious revolution of 1956, this anti-communist and anti-Soviet revolution, was a break in their effort and showed that national history still has power. The revolutionaries wanted to get back the old historical symbols, the original national holiday, the coat of arms, and the church bell ringing at noon. All these belong to historicity. The bell ringing was a 500-year tradition for a battle won against the Turks in the Middle Ages. So following the 1956 revolution, the communists resumed their efforts to breach Hungarian historical memory. In the last years of the communist dictatorship, a historian told in a conference, I quote, "After 56, Hungarian historiography played a significant and positive role in guiding public thinking. Based on the lessons of the 1956 events, we rightly regard nationalism as a dangerous phenomenon. The anti-nationalist concept had significant merits in the renewal of Hungarian historiography." So all in all, if we get back to the question posed in the introduction of this panel discussion, namely, why is there a stark division between Western Europe and Central Europe in this question? The answer is that we experienced the communist effort, and we have memories of it. Moreover, the nations of Central Europe all lived through periods earlier when national statehood was destroyed by outer forces. So, national independence, sovereignty, and self-determination is very dear to us. And one way of self-determination is holding the sway over our own history. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aaron. So, audience, you've actually listened now to quite a lot of stuff. I've got a bank of questions I'd like to put to the panelists, but I think much more important actually to come out and get a few comments and reflections from the floor. So a couple of my colleagues have microphones. If you'd like to speak, please just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. We'll begin. There's a gentleman there at the left. We'll get a few questions. We'll start a bit of a conversation, and then I'll ask my panelists to reflect on a few things I've heard.
Okay, I better stand up, I think, so that everybody can see me. My name is Jakob Kornidis. I'm working at the European Commission. And maybe one can also hear from my accent that I'm also coming from a Central European country. That is the country that actually defines Central Europe. To me, Central Europe is everything that once belonged either to the Roman Germanic Empire or to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Austria is actually in the middle of both. So I think we are the most central of the centrals. Anyway, I liked very much the discourse by Professor Furedi, and I think I can really agree to much what he says about the war against the past, but maybe I would like to just add a little rejoinder, and that is that, after all, the past is not always good. History is not always good, and it seems to me that precisely politicians like, for example, Viktor Orban or Kaczynski in Poland are also engaged in a war against the past of sorts, and that is the war against the communist past. I'm saying this from a more Germanic perspective because I think that very much many of the phenomena which we already described, this generally negative attitude against the past, is a very German thing, and of course for obvious reasons, but in Germany we see very often that the past is reduced to the Third Reich, and there is no other past than that, and so people tend to have a very negative attitude towards the past. But the truth is, of course, that the Third Reich is a part of the past which deserves a very negative attitude. And now, if you compare that to Russia today, Putin's Russia, I mean, whenever I go to Russia, I see that there's absolutely no negative attitude against anything. Basically, Putin molds together the Tsarist past with the Stalinist past and the Brezhnev past and his own present. And all and everything is glorious. The only thing that is not glorious is the downfall of the Soviet Union. So in a way, in short, my question is a certain fight against the past not meritorious?
Great, thanks. Some really good shades of meaning and question in that. Okay, I'll take my colleague, Maren, and then we'll come to the front.
Thank you. Maren Tom, MCC Brussels. I have a sort of question, maybe it's for Frank, but it's for all of you. Because Frank mentioned the idea that we're losing a moral compass if we lose the past. Maybe there's a different argument that we just concentrating on what has won is a kind of different moral compass, and that of utilitarianism. So what is very much en vogue is that everything is seen through the prism of suffering. You know, who can suffer the most, who has suffered the most, who has bled the most. And this is quite en vogue with the youth of today. So, and you know, you might have heard of the idea of oppression Olympics, which fits very well into this moral universe. And so, and it has come very clear to me how problematic this is after last year's events of 7th of October, when suddenly the German universities was full of students who suddenly said, no, the Holocaust was not special. It was not a special event that happened. It was just another event of where suffering happened. So, you know, Germans, don't be, you know, so upbeat about your past. And then I've absolutely realized how absolutely problematic this kind of morality is. Because if we forget that some things are worse than others, you know, even though suffering is a great pain for everybody, but there are moral frameworks that are much more worth defending than others. I know what we are losing with this. Is there maybe a question there, or maybe it was just a ranting comment? I quite don't know.
No, thanks so much. A great point. We'll come to the front here. Is there anyone else who wants to get in on this round? We'll come back out as well afterwards. But okay, Joanna.
Thank you. Joanna Williams, soon to be visiting fellow at MCC Budapest. My question really is about whether Europe's history and the distinctive East versus West histories can survive the EU and the kind of European Union's view on history. So I wrote a report about this time last year looking at the Council of Europe's work on teaching history, and it has some very strong ideas about the type of history that should be promoted in school. I mean, the good thing is, I guess, it does want to promote European history, but it not in terms of the achievements of Western civilization, kind of ancient Greeks, Romans, the story of a continent, if you like, but more topics like immigration, colonialism, gender. And I think this has a really negative impact upon this distinctively national history that could be contextualized against a broader European history of distinctively East and West stories. It robs history from the story of from belonging to specific groups of people, a kind of national conversation, a national identity. It robs history of chronology, and it does really focus on the negative, as Maren was saying, with the Holocaust almost serving as a moral year zero, and the EU institutions as our kind of savior from that experience.
Great, thanks. We'll come back out for another round of questions. Cotton, I thought you might take that question addressed at the end, because we're about to publish, and we'll do in the wake of this conference, a great essay of Cottelin's on a kind of real symbol of this, which is just a few steps down the road, the House of European History. So Cottelin, do you want to reflect on that first question?
Yes, actually I would take two questions and meld them together. The first one is about the hierarchies of suffering or the universalizing of suffering, and also your question whether Western, Eastern, Central European history can survive the European Union's truth regime. So on to the first questions, my opinion is that this is really dishonest to speak about hierarchies of suffering, to put one suffering over the other suffering. I know it because for us, for my generation, there was a great dilemma, the comparison between the Holocaust and the communism, the victims of the Holocaust, the victimhood of the Holocaust and the communism. And my stand in these issues was always that don't compare them, because then you in a way degrade the suffering, the pain of those who were victims of those regimes. Both tragedies and totalitarian ideologies needed to be confronted in order that the societies who suffered all of them, they understand their past and present. Now, as to Joanna's question about East-West, the memory cultures of East-West, it is true that when I arrived to Brussels, I made a kind of journey around my hats, and I entered the House of European History, which is just very close to here, and which is in a way a contrast to the concept of the Solvay Library, which is based on excellence and true research. The House of European History answers on your question, because it is what this house misses to understand is that you don't need to reconcile everything. You don't need to reconcile West and East. You need to understand the differences. If you don't understand the differences, you don't understand Europe. If you don't understand Europe, you will always have these infights and tensions, and now not just that, but also very hateful atmosphere. So what European memory, what this house suggests that there is a European memory and a European history, is a big mistake. This is the answer on your questions, and then I think the next step is really to listen to us, not just to MCC Brussels, but also to the reverberations of the discussions which will now be created, and trying to listen to the differences, because they make Europe to Europe.
Yeah, thanks. And Lawrence, I don't know, pick up on what you like, but maybe a logical one for you to take based on your opening remarks was that kind of challenge about how do you look the bad bits of history in the face without kind of succumbing to this kind of wholesale rejection of the past.
Well, I'll take the point from our Austrian friend then. And I think perhaps that Frank's opening remarks have slightly been misunderstood in the way the question was framed. Firstly, I don't think scholarly historians are in the business of moralizing, making history either good or bad. What we need to do is study it properly and accurately before we start making moral judgments. And I think what Frank was actually saying, probably better in Frank's mouth than in mine, is that in his examples, he was talking about our alienation from the past, not as it were making moral distinctions so much as being alienated from history. And that, of course, makes it easier for contemporary ideologies and forces to impose their views on us because we've erased civilization and we've erased all the experience of humankind and all the alternatives embodied in human history. And so I'd say that it's not a case of kind of trying to erase what is bad. I rather favor keeping what is bad in history to remind us of where, as it were, past societies have gone wrong. I think we have to take it all, good and bad, and the moral compass only works if you do see all elements, as it were, as one. That is humanity, sadly, and we must accept both good and bad.
Thanks, Lawrence. And Aaron, pick up what you like, maybe specifically this question of how you kind of, if you have a past, like in Hungary, of the communist past that you want to challenge, how do you challenge it without, again, succumbing to this kind of confrontational attitude with the past?
So concerning the question of our Austrian colleague in the outer ranks of this hall, so history, yes, it's not always good. But it doesn't mean that you have to falsify it. And I would say that it's not Orban or Kaczynski or whoever waging a war against communist past. It was a natural desire by the peoples of Central Europe to get back their own history instead of what was oppressed upon them from the outside. And I'm not sure if he knows, but in all Central European countries, Czechia, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and even in Slovenia, there are new memory institutions, and they exist for at least 2 decades now. In Hungary, it's a bit different, but I won't go in details. But it was independent of the governing parties that there was a falsified history. And I think the Austrian gentleman may know that there is a Ludwig Boltzmann Institute in Graz telling the stories of the war and the participation of Austrians in the war and revealing the stories of the prisoners of war in the Soviet Union originating from Austria. So I think it's nothing to do with present governments or whatever. And there is another thing, because he made some remarks on Vladimir Putin's memorial policies. And yes, this is something we can observe as a new wave of falsification of history. But on the other hand, it sounds dangerous. I would say it sounds hurting for us in Central Europe. But on the other hand, if we consider that the Russians, they do not have a global message, nor a message for Central Eastern Europe, which is the closest foreign land to them, it means that they have no designs for these lands. Because in the last occasion in 1945, when they had designs for Central Europe, they forged out an ideological message, you know, liberation, for example. I had a quarrel with some Western colleagues of the Liberation Route Europe. It's a very, very strong institution in Western Europe, particularly in France and in the Netherlands. That liberation, for example, for us, it's fake. It was not liberation at all. Okay, we got rid of the Nazi occupation and the collaborationists, but it was not liberation at all. And saying that it was not liberation, it's not a war against any kind of memory. It's the restoration of memory. So that's all what I wanted to say.
Well, let's get a few more questions. I know my colleague Agnieszka would like to speak, and then we'll have the microphone down at the front.
Agnieszka Kolek, MCC Brussels.
First in the front.
I just wanted to ask a question in relation to the East versus the East versus West.
I lived for 20 years in Britain, then I lived for a year and a half in Poland.
I experienced communism as a child. I lived in Katowice, where the coal mine, Kopalnia Wujek, had an uprising, and there were 9 shot coal miners. So I also experienced it as a child, the war with the military police and what was happening with the local community at that time. So very vivid memories. And when I was in Poland for a year and a half now, I had an impression that there is a naivety in the intellectual class in Poland, and then I will kind of take a risk to say maybe in Central Eastern Europe, that we think we are immune to the war on the past. And I think what we don't recognize, that the underlying theme is shame. It's to awaken shame and to shame us into that everyone is bad, we are all bad, we should apologize and we should kneel and take whatever comes from people that know better. So I pose it as a challenge to you, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Great, thanks. We'll take, yes, at the front, and then Agnieszka, if you give that microphone over there. Great.
Patricia Santos from El Debate, Spain. All of you have explained to us some fake narratives that have distorted history at some point from different perspectives. So, and I guess that by now we can sort of take it as something that is already in the past, that those struggles, maybe they are still alive at some point. What I am more concerned is what Katalin said, if I understood, is the memory of truth. And all of you have also mentioned this present struggle. I would ask you, when do you consider that this battle is over? I think Professor Goldman has said something about the truth, but I would like to listen to your views on this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so no, can you pass this one just along the row?
Robert Tyler, New Direction Foundation in Brussels. I have a question about the search for truth in Central and Eastern Europe and the role that lustration policies in the 90s had in coming to some form of closure, and whether such policies are perhaps revisitable today.
Great, thanks. And then we'll take this, right? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nina Wolf. Lately, I've been studying about the history of the use of cobalt. I was trying to place it into a project I'm writing about. But it occurred to me over the past few days that what we are fighting about in terms of climate change and cobalt and lithium and all of these essential minerals that we desperately need now, and coal and steel, are still the same as what had been being fought about in World War II. So I'm just curious as to whether you think that perhaps educating people on some of the other causes of these world wars in terms of the elements that we need and use every day might broaden an understanding. I don't know if that's clear.
Great, thanks. Katalin, maybe I'll ask you for a few reflections from any of those first.
Yes, I would
and then we'll come back out again. Yeah, sure.
I would like to answer on the question, on Agnieszka's question, whether we can withstand and whether we can be naive to believe that we are an exemption, that this the alienation from the past, that the past as a guilt will not invade us. This concept. And of course, I started to bring up an example of a museum. And because I have in my background Jewish museums, I am an expert on Jewish museums, have been occupying myself with discussion for the last 20 years, I can see that museums and especially Jewish museums became a Trojan horse of woke ideas and also of the war against the past. Because while these museums, they were my hope after 1989, I thought I find Central Europe in these museums, in this crisscross of cultures and languages. I can see that they are manipulated and operationalized to bring up all the minority problems of the world, the LGBTQ minorities, the Roma minorities, suppressed minorities, and to universalize Jewish suffering. I also say that they are politicized, not just there, but I bring up them as an example. And they are given an exceptionalist role. For example, I bring you a concrete example, the history of Polish Jews in Warsaw, the Polin Museum, a great institution. This institution became a completely political institution, attacking the populist, national conservative government of PiS. It had it in his mission, like concretely, that they will fight this government. So what I will to say that yes, there is a danger, and this danger is coming through education, museums, culture. It is sneaky. It is coming in through these wonderful words we were thirsty after, democracy, pluralism, and so on. But we need to be aware, we intellectuals and academicians and museologists and so on, not to open the door to the sanctuary, really, to hold it close and just to let enter those who don't have these intentions.
Yeah, great. A really interesting point. We should get you to write something on that for MCC Brussels. But Lawrence, a couple of quick reflections.
Yes, well, I'll pick up the question over here, which I think was basically what is truth if we're thinking about historical truth. And I don't really have a direct answer to that, except to say that in the West at present, there is a problem in the way history is being written because the link has been broken between sources and interpretation, if you understand the point I'm getting at. The best history is written from the sources, and we know that sources are often incomplete, they're fragmentary, but the best history nevertheless tries to put together the sources that we have and to see those sources in the round and to balance between the competing interpretations that might come out of the sources. And this is something that's very deeply ingrained in, I'm sure, historians in the audience and certainly in the historical tradition that trained me. The problem that we face is a kind of ideological view of history in which the sources can be ignored and you can impose upon history the interpretation that you want. And the way that history reclaimed and those associated with it have tried to deal with this is, as it were, to put up against ideological interpretations actually grounded in what happened based upon the sources. Now, I know that there are limitations with that approach, and source-based history is not truth, but it's better than the alternative, and it's what we used to have, and it's what has made the historical disciplines in my country and in Western Europe as successful and as culturally important as they have been until now. So my response is, I don't know what truth is, but I do know what source-based history is.
Great, thanks. Aaron, a quick reflection.
Yeah, first of all, I understood Agnieszka's question as not a question, but as a remark, and I fully agree that that's the only answer I can give you, Agnieszka. The other thing, there was a question about the lustration processes after the fall of communism. And I can tell you, it was not a success story. So in some Central European countries, there were, for example, in Czechia, a very strong lustration process. But I wouldn't like to evaluate it in place of our Czech colleagues, but it wasn't that successful. If there is a former collaborational member of the communist state security in the seat of the President of the Republic of Czechia now. Secondly, there was also a very strong effort in Poland. They have a special investigationary or a special prosecutor's office attached to the National Memory Institute. And they can even launch processes against dead persons, which is unique in European judiciary systems. But there were no Eichmann trials on the communist side, neither in Poland. For example, in some cases, the Polish special prosecutor's office asked for extradition of some Polish communist criminals from the United Kingdom, from Sweden, and they refused it. In Hungary, I can tell you that it's absolutely a kind of failure in the question or in the field of judicial processes. I think there were 40 cases at court in the 1990s and in the thousands, maybe reaching out to the 2010s. And only in four cases were there verdicts. These were the so-called volley fire processes in connection with the retribution following the 1956 revolution. My explanation is I perceive it from a small nation's view. And I think that the great powers who had a sway over the fate of the Western world, they had no intention to test us with the how to say, with the security, with the balance of Europe. And you can read more in John O'Sullivan's preface to Richard Wegutzko's book, The Demon in Free Societies.
Great, thanks. So there are definitely a few more questions. So the people here first, someone there, and then Frank in the front, and great in the front. Okay, so we've got quite a few questions now. We've got time to get run in if people are brief.
Hi, hello. My name is Andor Deli. I'm with the Hungarian Ministry of EU Affairs. And I just have a short question regarding what's happening in other parts of the world concerning the negation of history. We dwell usually here and in other parts of the Occidental or the Western world about this, but what's the people in China are doing, or what's happening in Latin America or in Africa in this regard? Do they have some shameful events that they have to evaluate? So I'm just wondering what's happening in other places in the world in this regard. Thank you.
Was the person next to you after a question as well, or no? No? Okay, there's this one here. Can we get, Agnes, can we get that microphone down to the front here? Yeah.
Thank you, Jacob. I wish I'd received a trigger warning before I arrived here, but I was triggered by something that Professor Goldman said about source-based history. That almost sounded like you still believe in facts. Because I teach here in Brussels at the so-called Free University, and my students know absolutely nothing, Jon Snow. That's the one thing they get, you know, the cultural reference to silly series. They think that history should be understood not with facts, but power dynamics. I'm preaching to the converted here. Everything in the past, facts are secondary. It's Foucault, it's Baudrillard, it's the same old crap, if you like. It's also easy because you don't need to learn anything. But there is a bridge. It's worse than C.P. Snow 1959. There's a bridge between our generation of slightly elderly people like myself, youngsters in present company accepted, and the new generation, say the post-1990 generation, who don't even believe in facts. They think everything is a construct. And it's very difficult to then still teach history of knowledge, as I do, and history of ideas and philosophy of knowledge, with kids who don't even know that there was such a thing as, say, the Reformation. And I'm not even joking. So I'd like the panel to address this divide, and how can we approach this? How should we approach this? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let's take these ladies at the front. Get that one down to Frank. Thanks, Benny.
My name is Dorina Marton, and I'm a student of MCC Law School Budapest. And my question would be, in your point of view, how does political parties of the present use historical revisionism to protect and justify their agendas, and what are some good and bad examples of doing that?
Great, thank you. Pass it to the lady next to you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Lili Mező. I'm also a student from MCC from Budapest. And my question is that the Council of Europe has established an international cooperation titled the Observatory on History Education, and there was also a huge chaos concerning the Parliament's decision advocating for a common historical consciousness this January. So instead of national histories, they propose a unified perspective of Europe as a continent, and my question is, what are your thoughts on that, and what can be the implications of that? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let's take Frank.
Thank you. I think there is a difference between historical revisionism, which is normal, happens all the time, fabricating history, which is normal, doing what Putin did, where he makes it up as he goes along, kind of history, which is normal. There's a difference between that and what I call the war against the past, because the war against the past is not just revisionism or rewriting history. It's basically about drawing a line between the present and the past and saying that that's a no-go area, creating a year zero ideology, where the entire past becomes a history of shame. Now, Putin, for example, does the opposite. He doesn't say that the past of Russia is a story of shame. He thinks everything is glorious, right? So the communists that were in Hungary didn't say that everything in Hungarian past was shameful. They found, for example, the rebellion of Dózsa or somebody else, and they would say, here are our heroes, or Marxists would say that Spartacus in Rome, really brilliant, and they would pick and choose their own heroes, right? This is the first time where there are no heroes. Everything about the past, from this perspective in the West, is something that we should hate and distance ourselves from. And to that extent, this is a new original development that is far more insidious, because in this case, it's an entirely culturally driven, semi-totalitarian, colonizing ambition, which is really about using the past to take over the present. And I think we need to make very clear that the stakes are much, much higher, because I think, as you were saying, when it comes to facts, we can always use the facts to challenge historical revisionism. We can always use memory in that, but this is a cultural war that is being waged, and it requires very different tools and very different instruments to neutralize it.
Great, thanks. Is there anyone else who'd like to get in? Yeah, so I think we've got a couple more people, and then I'll ask our panel to kind of sum up. So we've got there and then towards the back.
I'm Miroslav Vaněk from Prague. I have a just answer to Aaron, because I'm from Czech, and I would like to say that I totally agree with Aaron that it's terrible for the Czech society when you have to choose in the president election from two agents on STB or army. It's 35 years after the communism fell down, and it's terrible, and it's something what influences us in the present and in the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks. There's a gentleman, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Lazar Potrebic, and thank you for a great discussion. I have a short question for Professor Goldman. You were mentioning that the tearing down of the monuments in Ukraine is a positive example. But would you also say that it is also some kind of war against the past? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Does anyone else want to get in? We've got plenty more time across the day for lots of discussion, and also lunch coming up as well, so a chance to dig into it a bit more. But if that's it, I'll ask my panelists to just sum up with a few final remarks, taking into account some of the questions and anything else you wanted to pick up from the day. Obviously, I'm sure Frank's remarks will draw some interest, but I do think it's important to kind of tease out what has been a recurring theme of lots of these questions, which is what is kind of distinct or unique about what's going on today compared to various kind of other historical episodes, say the communist period in Hungary being one of them, and what's different now, especially what's originated in Western Europe or in America, about our attitude to the past compared to things that we know and are kind of more familiar with from history. So, Gotselin, some final reflections.
Yes, my final reflection is also an answer on a few of these questions about education. I think if we speak about the war against the past, our most important figure are the students, the young people. And I just bring up very shortly, I'm reading an essay of my good colleague, David Engel. His name is very well known here. And he describes his experiences from Warsaw. He was teaching in Warsaw at university for many years, and his experiences are terrifying. And I have the feeling that the level of knowledge at youth in Central and Eastern Europe is even lower than your complaint was about your students here in Brussels. And I think that really this is a tragedy, that there is a kind of tiredness and indifference vis-à-vis the past in Eastern and Central Europe. This is not a war, not even a war. The war is better because the war is active, you know, you can counteract. But I think there is a kind of sleeping in, and this is something where you are the hope that we need to oppose. So that would be my final remark, that you are the most important, the youth in this war, in this conflict.
Yeah, very true. Lawrence, some final thoughts?
Yes, to the English gentleman who's trying to din some facts into his students. I suspect, in fact, that it's always been like that at secondary level. Most kids' grasp of history is pretty unprofound and pretty vague. Who does what to whom in what order is not really something they focus on when they're 15 or 16. The problem, I think, is at university level rather than at your level, in a sense. I mean, what secondary education, and we'll be talking about this, of course, later, what historical education at that age should be doing is engendering curiosity and interest in the past, and hopefully a sense that it is different from the present. What's going wrong, I think, is more at university level, where, as Frank said, you know, pointing to the Harvard curriculum, you have the imposition of contemporary present-minded ideologies onto a past that is so very different. And that's where I think we should be focusing, well, at all levels, but that's where the problems actually derive from, not least because it's often in universities that the secondary curriculum is actually established. It's academics in universities and educational bureaucrats at that level who design the secondary school curriculum, certainly in my country, in Britain. And just to pick up the point about Babi Yar and the monuments there and the war against the past, I think we're perhaps talking about two different things. I think Frank's war against the past is a much larger and much more important civilizational aspect. All I was saying when I mentioned Babi Yar was simply that if, as it were, the past is recorded inaccurately, as it was in the Soviet era about Babi Yar, then we must correct it. And that's a smaller scale activity which has always gone on and which should go on. And it's part of our duty as historians to make sure that people have accurate access to the past. But I think Frank's question, the war against the past, is rather different, really, because it's a civilizational struggle to, as it were, control the way history is understood at a much bigger level.
Great, thanks. And Aaron?
Yeah, first of all, on the question of Ukraine and topping the statues of Lenin and who else, Soviet soldiers, whatever, monuments, I don't think it is the problem that they do it. The problem is that who else is being statued instead of those. Because in many cases, these are figures which can be questioned in many ways. And I think we don't speak about it enough, but it's going to mean a problem. The question of European history, yes, there is a European history. We don't have to invent it. We just have to summarize it. The problem is that here there is a museum in Brussels. It's called House of European History. And it's the same what Frank Furedi thought, that it's also a part of this war against our common European past. I won't go in details because it would include a kind of debate with someone from the European House of History.
We might have to lead a parade down to the museum later on and go have the argument there.
Historical revisionism. I think it's a very dangerous expression because history as a whole or in details is being revisioned by historians as they write new books and they discover new sources or deem older sources to be questionable, whatever. So for example, I think 10 years ago, the fact that Stalin's Soviet Union prepared a war against not only the National Socialist German Reich, but also against the whole of Europe, was a kind of revisionism, which was a whitewashing of Nazi Germany, but it is not. It's also a question of the facts. And coming to the facts, we had a debate in the Hungarian Academy of Sciences concerning the forced collectivization, the setting up of cooperative farms in Hungary during communism. And one of the scholars told us that all the sources, the archival sources, they in many cases just confuse the researchers. So can you imagine that? That's about facts. And just one word on Furedi's remark. I think there were some cases in communism in the deepest and saddest years of the Soviet Union when they started this war, this civilizational war against the totality of the past. And they also attacked family on the very same basis. For example, there was a very common story in the Soviet Union about the young, brave pioneer who reports on his parents to the authorities and sends them to jail. Thanks.
Thanks. We thank all our speakers. So, that opening and the opening from Frank and this discussion is going to set us up very nicely for the day. I think we've got a lot more to dig into, not least the other panels that kind of take a broader look first, and then we got another one on history. But for now, I'd like to invite you all to have some lunch with us, which will be downstairs. I need to say, if you arrived kind of recently or lately and haven't registered, please go through to the registration desk so that we can keep track of you, and also so that you can get one of our new MCC Brussels branded pens, which I'm sure you're especially after. And secondly, to say that over lunch, Frank will be signing copies of his book. So if you'd like to get one, or if you have one, Frank would be delighted to sign it. But for now, lunch.